This is Living Catholic with Father Don Wolf. Living Catholic is a fresh look at issues confronting each of us today. This show deals with living Catholic, what that means for Catholics, as well as the impact on the rest of society. You certainly don't have to be Catholic to enjoy this show. And now your host, Father Don Wolf.
Welcome, Oklahoma, to Living Catholic. I'm Father Don Wolf, pastor of Sacred Heart Parish and the shrine and rector of the Shrine of Blessed Stanley Rother. We're coming up now on the celebration of the anniversary of the martyrdom of Blessed Stan Rother. On the 28th of July, we'll commemorate the 43rd year since Blessed Stanley's martyrdom in Santiago Atitlan, Guatemala, at the hands of a death squad. Stan was killed in his rectory about 1 o'clock in the morning on Tuesday, July the 28th, 1981. He'd spent 13 years as a missionary from Oklahoma, staffing the Micatocla, which is the acronym for Misión Católica de Oklahoma, the Oklahoma Catholic Mission in Spanish. His death was the capstone of the years of his selfless service to the people of the town of Santiago Atitlan. There are a number of events we have planned as part of our celebration. Of course, there'll be Mass celebrated all week at 12:15, praying for the canonization of Father Rother, as well as a prayer of support for all missionaries throughout the world. On Friday at the shrine, we'll have a bilingual night prayer at 7 p.m., praying for all of those who struggle to live the faith courageously. On Saturday, there'll be a health fair and gathering as we pause to celebrate at the shrine. We'll have activities for children and adults. Everyone is invited then. On Saturday night, following the evening Mass at 5 o'clock, we'll pray a rosary for peace together, that Our Lady might intercede for all of those who are troubled by war and violence in their land. On Sunday, all of our Masses will be offered for the canonization of Father Rother, and in addition, following the 11 o'clock Mass, there'll be a ribbon-cutting ceremony at our new classroom annex of Blessed Toribio Romo, located at 100 Southeast 89th Street, just west of the shrine. Everyone is invited. As we pause to celebrate the martyrdom of Blessed Stanley, it's incumbent upon us to deepen our understanding of his sanctity. Our shrine is dedicated to his examples of holiness in the selfless sacrifice he offered to his people in service of the gospel. But there's much more to the life and witness of Blessed Stanley than being a missionary in Guatemala or choosing to stay in his parish when he could have left. In fact, the challenges we all face first in understanding what it means to be a saint and then what it means for him to be a saint. After this comes the challenge of knowing how a saintly example helps us make a sense of our lives and our journey to God's love and the holiness we're all offered. We should begin with the question almost everyone asks, although deep down they know the answer when they ask it, which is, why do we have saints? This is an especially important question in our environment in which we're not always dealing with a Catholic mindset or a Catholic point of view. For us who've grown up with the recognition of saints, it's an easy response. But for those for whom the notion of saints is foreign, it's a more difficult question to answer. The truth is, saints have been a part of the Christian worldview from the beginning. Those whose examples of holiness were extraordinary have been held up as examples to the whole community since the beginning of the life of the Church. The way they lived their lives and embodied their commitment to Christ invited all Christians to strive for holiness. From the first generation, the whole Church noted the examples of men like St. Polycarp, who died in 155, and St. Ignatius, who died in the year 140, both of whom were martyred for the faith. These men wanted to live as St. Paul had lived, committed to proclaiming the gospel everywhere and to everyone, no matter the price. Just as in all communities, the Christians talked of their example and how their commitment to the faith imitated the life of Christ, and how all Christians could learn the lessons of holiness by learning about the lives of these special people. From the beginning, this was so. And in this, they were then even following the example of the account of St. Stephen laid out in the Acts of the Apostles. St. Stephen was condemned by those who were upset at his preaching. They conspired to put him to death because of his proclamation of Christ as the fulfillment of the hope of Israel. As the men who surrounded him took up the stones in their hands with which to kill him, the accusers heard him forgive them for what they were doing. St. Stephen recapitulated the example of Christ in everything he did. Those who knew him and his example knew that the message of Christ was for everyone and provided a way to live and to die so that all of life was transfigured. Stephen died glorifying Christ. All those who sought to imitate Christ could fulfill their desires by imitating Stephen. He became the model for those who sought to live the message of Christ. That's the purpose of the saints. They bring us an example of living the life of Christ. The formula for this accomplishment is simple. I can imitate Christ by knowing and imitating the example of someone who himself has imitated Christ. St. Stephen imitated Christ by knowing the example, and so by knowing the example of Stephen, I can take courage from him and imitate him as he was imitating Christ. In the second generation of Christianity, I could imitate St. Polycarp, who imitated St. Paul, who imitated St. Stephen, who was imitating Christ. The more closely I identify with the example of holiness of a saint, the more I am connected to the presence and the example of Jesus himself. Saints become then the gateway to the presence of Christ in my own life. For believers everywhere, these examples of the life of holiness were also heroes, and all people want heroes to emulate and to guide their lives. We're a people who make our way in the world through imitation. We find our heroes and come to know them and then come to imitate them. That's how we learn how to live. This happens in every culture and in every human community throughout all time. For Christians, their heroes are the saints, who have displayed extraordinary holiness as they made their way through the confusing highways of life. My saintly hero growing up was St. Isaac Jogues, the missionary to the Mohawks in French Canada. He was a Jesuit. He was part of the incredible evangelical effort that all those men made in the remotest corners of the world in their time. He'd gone among the people, taught them the faith, and served their needs. In the course of his work, he had been captured and tortured and threatened with death. He escaped and came back to France at the command of his superiors, but he eventually returned to his work in Canada, was captured again, tortured again, and then martyred. His bravery in the midst of such brutality appealed to my idolism when I was young. I paid attention to him. I was also fascinated that he was among the first to go into the woods and encounter the people there. He fired up my imagination as a kid. Because of this, I didn't want to become a missionary, and I knew there weren't any unknown places in the northeastern woods anymore. But knowing there was someone who had lived his life, someone who had laid his life down for the truth of faith in Jesus, told me that faith in Jesus was worthwhile, that it meant something real and was something important. I don't know if I could have said what those things were or what the apex of importance was, but they didn't matter compared to the fact that he embodied them. It's the same with all of our heroes. We don't have to duplicate them in every detail in order for their examples to animate our own. They become the model, the one who makes the potential in life into what is actually real. You know, paying attention to saints is not that different from the example of, say, a 12-year-old boy having perhaps Patrick Mahomes as his athletic model. This child may never be able to throw a spiral or outrun the kids on his playground or even play football at all. But Patrick Mahomes can be the one who shows that it is possible to be extraordinary, who can typify that life is something more than just making it to the end of the day, who can make it clear that a person can be a hero. Those are all things a 12-year-old boy wants to know are true and real for him. Finding that they are real because they are present in the life of his football player makes it possible for a sixth grader to strive for them in his own life. And we all know the other part of this dynamic as well. The striving is important, even when the realistic 12-year-old knows that he's never going to be the greatest quarterback in the world. The imitation of his example is the imitation of what the example embodies, not just what the superstar does. This is something we all understand. Once I was visiting a Guatemalan family who invited me to their house for supper. Their son wanted to show me his house. So when we came to the bedroom, he showed me his poster of Michael Jordan hanging over his bed. "Why do you have that poster?" I asked him. Of course, I already knew the answer, because he said, "I want to play basketball like Michael Jordan." Well, of course he did. I knew, and soon he'd know, that the NBA was not waiting for the first 4'10" Guatemalan superstar to come along. The chances are he'd never play basketball like the greatest basketball player of all time. But he could still know that there are heroes whose lives point to what is bigger than life. And we all want to go toward the direction they point, to that which is bigger than life. So it's natural for us to strive to imitate our heroes. In the life of the faith, our heroes become those whose examples inspire us and inform us. They are those who make the faith alive. When St. Polycarp went to his execution, it was only 100 years after the time of Christ. His parishioners watched him bravely embrace the sentence from the Roman consul. When the soldiers stacked the wood at his feet to burn him alive, the people who watched him and who later heard about his execution knew he was thinking at that moment of how Jesus had died. And at the very end, before the flames were lit, he forgave his accusers and prayed for the ones who lit the pyre. The whole story became a chance for those who knew him to know that it was possible to die as Jesus did, trusting in the faithfulness of God to transform suffering into glory. But he wasn't only a hero, he was an example. It had been 100 years since Jesus had died on the cross. Everyone then wondered what such a death could mean in their time. Every faithful person tried to imagine if they would have the courage to live and die as St. Paul and St. Peter had. When Polycarp gave up his ghost in the flames that consumed him, they knew the life of faith was not just a story, it was an actual, true life. And if it was real for Jesus and Paul and Peter and Polycarp, it could be real for them too. That's the power of saintly life. As we remember and celebrate the life of Blessed Stanley Rother, we're invited into the same realization. His struggles in his ministry and the final decisions that brought about his death, they're all invitations for us to see the faith lived out. Stan came from Oklahoma, not from some other place, far away in geography or time. He went to the seminary and had to depend on the judgment of others to find his way into the priesthood, like all men do. And when he was struggling to serve his people in Guatemala, he had to fall back on his own judgment and intuition and inspiration to get the answers he needed. In all these things, Stan was like the rest of us. His martyrdom and his great example of faithful living are the invitation to know that it is possible to have a life given over to Christ in our own day and time. Faithfulness is not only for the early church or for the Middle Ages or for the ages of missions or just for bishops and popes. It's for any of us who are willing to give ourselves to Christ in our lives today. More than anything else, saints embody the faith. That is, they can bring the truths of the faith into the heartbeats of life. We know and honor them just because of that. This is the heart of heroism. It is what we see in them. So when Stan decided to go back to Guatemala to be with his people, although he could have stayed in Guatemala without any condemnation or shame from anyone, he was putting his life on the line. The idea of being faithful and all the ideas of being saintly, which are airy and spiritual, they condensed into the flesh and blood of his body that he put at risk as he walked the streets of his village and said Mass in his church. Trusting in Jesus to bring his life to glory wasn't just an intuition or a habit for Stan. It was him throwing himself into the fires of life. We can only live life face first, after all, where we are the most vulnerable. All saints and the life and example of Blessed Stanley live this out as they run into the hard things of life in their most vulnerable parts. Our question for now is the most important. Does Blessed Stanley's example continue to speak to us today? Now, that may sound odd since we're still hearing about the examples of St. Stephen and St. Polycarp nearly 2,000 years since their martyrdom. Is Stan's example so fragile as to be forgettable only a few decades after his death? It may sound odd to wonder, but it's not an empty question. We do have the right to ask if his example will speak to us right now in our world and amid our challenges. After all, the rich faith environment he grew up in doesn't exist anymore. There are just about no places left in which a farm family lives amidst the rich support of relatives and the intricate web of faith, so that unquestioning loyalty and uninterrupted piety are present with them every day. living in a farmhouse with no contact with the currents of the outside world and no concerns about the integrity of the faith is just about impossible in our day. And being part of a parish in which every face is familiar and every family is a relation and virtually every acquaintance is a member isn't going to happen. The world that founded and sustained Blessed Stanley Rother has passed away. It's not possible to live Stan's life today, even if you were a Rother living in Okarche. And the church into which he grew to adulthood is gone too. Those few huddled Catholics of Oklahoma from years ago, the guarded minority of outsiders who watched the world go by from the islands of their isolation, they're all gone. Much of the enthusiasm for the grandeur of the church and its mission among its people has faded. The lively invitation of the parish of Okarche to send its many young people into the convent and the seminary so as to fulfill its obligation to those who founded and sustained it, that has passed away. And the singular conviction that the entire world was measured and weighed and judged by the standards of the grandees of Okarche and them alone has also gone by the board. It is not possible to find someone of today who could have the same ecclesial life as that which Stan Rother took for granted. That age of the church has disappeared, along with the danger of the frontier and the breaking of the sod. The possibilities of Stan's example have also been altered. Looking at the energies and enigmas of modern society, we now note an incredible change from the ministry he spent his life in. Guatemala is now not the missionary desert in which the gospel was withered and stunted so that the Oklahomans could arrive to build and cultivate and hope for a new harvest. There it is instead a place of great faith and incredible energy, buzzing with the potential for inspiration and imitation. To go to Guatemala as a missionary today would be to go to learn the gospel rather than to teach it. There is virtually no part of his mission that we could duplicate today. So, what's the meaning of his saintliness? How could we make our lives conform to his example? And why would we bother? We're suburban and mobile, untethered and disconnected. Our families are scattered and our relationships are strained. The faith seems to be fading among us, and we're more familiar with those who come among us as missionaries than we are with those who leave from us to become missionaries. We have to ask, can we even begin to contemplate what Stan's example is to be for us? Does his saintliness hold up after 4 decades? It's been a long time. But if we're distracted by imagining we're to imitate Stan's holiness by imitating his example in every way, we've missed the point. Stan's life was his life, entrusted to him by his circumstances and formed by his decisions. It was not duplicable, even by someone who was born in the same year as he and grew up a half a mile from his house, because each saint lives his own life, so that the recipe of his holiness belongs to him alone. The details that shaped his life are important because they teach us of his life, but the heart of his holiness is not in the details, but in the faithfulness the details form. This is because holiness is not a mantle bestowed over the shoulder of a saint like the cape draped over Miss America. Holiness is lived and shaped by the saint through the course of his life. Stan didn't accumulate the details of his life in order to achieve the status of a holy priest. He sought to do the will of God in his parish and to make the right decisions in his pastorate so that the church might be alive there. This meant he had to know what his people were like and how they suffered. He had to weigh out the options available to him and to them, and then decide what was appropriate and not appropriate. In all these things, he had to understand himself and his tendencies, and then measure whether they were helping or hindering. More than anything, he had to seek the will of God in the Scriptures, in the liturgy, according to the guidance of the church, in the instructions of his bishop, and through submitting himself to prayer. In all these things, he had to measure his mistakes and repair his faults and errors. And by the way, he had to do all these things in an environment in which the priests of his diocese and the people of his village were being kidnapped and tortured and murdered. In short, he had to live his life there, in his place and time. his life and his ministry were to navigate through these complications and to find a way to be faithful. Thomas Merton once wrote that spiritual directors had to be particularly sensitive to the images they used when they talked to those they were directing. In his example, he reminded them that they often use words like the pathway of holiness. Such an image is helpful and rich, and it has innumerable examples in the tradition of Christian spirituality. But he said that image can be misleading. After all, the pathway of holiness is like an explorer walking through a jungle, cutting away the bush with a machete. He knows the direction he wants to go, and he's exploring the landscape along the way, which is why he's hacking away at the vegetation so he can keep moving in the right direction. But the only pathway is the one behind him. He can identify it, and then he can point it out to anyone who wants to know where he's been. But if another person wants to go in the same direction, but starts out from a different place, their pathway is going to be different than his. This is the reminder concerning all examples of holiness and a description of all those who glory in the saints. What we receive from them is the gift of their exploration and the direction of their journey. If we want to be like them, we gather from them all we can find of what they have discovered about the landscape and the contours of their territory. Then we walk into the jungle and begin to cut our way through the wilderness. We can be confident that where they have gone will be a help in getting us to where we need to be. Stan Rother is blessed because he strove to serve God, who had called him to be a pastor and a companion. Stan's holiness was the product of his willingness to place his life in God's hands as he used all of his skills to navigate the complications of his life and the intricacies of his parish as they were. When he did this, all of the fruit of his living ripened into the example of God at work in his world. That's what holiness is, the good fruit of the tree of life well tended. If we want to be holy, we can look to the examples Stan gave and then see how best to care for the orchard planted outside our window. What can we learn from a saint? Almost everything, if we're willing. Back in just a moment. Welcome back to our final segment, Faith in Verse. We have a poem today called The Spatter of Blood. We seem to love the spatter of blood. Oh, of course, we don't force it, as if we were but spittle and fur, prehistoric beasts loving sacrificial feasts, where our enemies perish as we them cherish. No, our lust is for now. These days we endow with the power to kill, as we watch and thrill, to the promise of death that can so well address the problems we have and then want to salve by removing their threat, so we no longer fret. We like it easy, you see, prefer ourselves free, and so opt for mayhem, besides us and our friends, to love blood's spatter, as long as it matters. We can then conclude we've gotten through this interlude. That's the spatter of blood. Our celebration of the life and the witness of Father Stanley Rother continues all through next week with the culmination of our celebration on the 28th at the shrine. I hope that you can join us then as we celebrate the life of this extraordinary and holy man. Hope to see you then.
Living Catholic is a production of Oklahoma Catholic Radio. To learn more, visit okcr.org.